the next generation of REIT leaders is not likely going to inherit momentum. They're going to have to create it through judgment, through relationships, through the work of building organizations that are adaptable and can stay aligned even when things are uncertain. And the good news is the leaders we talk to already get this. They feel it.
Hello, welcome to the REIT Report. I'm your host, Sarah Borgson-Keto. Today I'm talking to Ferguson Partners about a recent perspective they authored that looks at the leadership capabilities shaping the next generation of REITs. Ferguson Partners is a global professional services firm specializing in executive and board recruitment, leadership compensation, and management consulting. With me to share their latest thoughts on leadership are Courtney Calinog, Senior Director, and Mike Cordingley, Managing Director at Ferguson. Courtney, Mike, welcome to you both.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. This is great. Great to be back.
First of all, what made you think that now was the right time to consider this question of future leadership in the REIT sector? And how did you go about gathering information?
Yes, this is something that I would say has been building for a while. And over the past few years, the conversations that we're having with clients have started to expand. The energy is still very much around sourcing opportunities and deploying capital. However, we started to hear more and more a second question layered on top of that, which is, do we have the right leader for this environment? So hearing that question got our attention, so we decided to sit down with 10 CEOs and senior executives across a range of asset classes. And we asked the question, what capabilities will define the next generation of REIT leaders? And we didn't go into this conversation with a checklist of any kind because we wanted to see what organically came up on its own. And it was notable how consistent the answers were across sectors, across company sizes. The leaders were describing similar leadership needs, which we'll get into a bit more later in the podcast, I know.
Can you talk about the current operating environment for REIT leaders and how does it compare to earlier periods for the sector?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. The operating environment for REITs today is more complex, it's more bifurcated, and it's frankly less forgiving than in prior cycles. Where cheap capital and low rate volatility used to carry a lot of the story, today with the Fed holding rates and signaling elevated uncertainty, balance sheet discipline and capital allocation are now front and center for a lot of these leaders. So what feels different in that sector is sorting itself into two different groups: platforms with differentiated assets and real demand drivers. So you're thinking like AI infrastructure, logistics, housing, aging demographics, and platforms still asking the public markets for some patience. And you can see that in the numbers across a variety of platforms, both in take privates, in some M&A, inorganic growth activity underway in the marketplace. Scaled simplification and private market conviction are really reshaping the landscape. And yet at the same time, we're seeing lots of great performance coming from REITs who are still not necessarily seeing the benefit in the public markets just yet. And so the best REITs today aren't just operating companies. They're thinking about themselves as capital allocation platforms. And the environment is going to reward those who can play both offense and defense at the same time.
In your discussions with CEOs and executives, was there any through line about some of the key qualities that are needed to succeed in this environment?
There was, and I would say it surprised us a bit because not a single executive led with technical or financial skills. Not that those things don't matter, they absolutely do, of course, but they were treated as table stakes. They were treated as price of admission. And what the leaders kept coming back to were people-centered capabilities. They talked about executive presence. That was a big one, the kind of executive presence that steadies the room. They talked about self-awareness, knowing when to push, when to listen, how your behavior's landing with other people. And another thing they talked about was the ability to create clarity when things are murky and build trust when people are skeptical. And we think about leadership in three buckets at Ferguson Partners, which can be a helpful framework to talk through some of this. The three buckets are perspective, people, and performance. And what we found is that in a constrained environment like this one, the people bucket moves to the front. So self-awareness, interpersonal effectiveness, talent development, building networks, those came up the most. And they did not exist in isolation. So leaders also did point to things like vision and strategy formulation and decision-making and being adaptive and agile. So it's really the integration of all three of those pieces: perspective, people, and performance that matter. But the people-centered capabilities are what move to the foreground in our conversations.
And would you say that these skills are ones that CEOs need to have in place before taking on that top role, or can they be developed while they're on the job?
I would say that the answer is both. So some of these capabilities need to be pretty well in place before someone steps into the CEO seat. Things like self-awareness, how you show up under pressure, how you interact with people, those have to be there. You can sharpen them on the job, but the foundation has to exist. Other things like building networks at scale, developing that enterprise level strategic lens, learning to read and translate market signals, those get deeper once you're in the seat because you just don't get the full picture until you're in that CEO seat. I would say the big thing, though, is that, and Mike will talk about this as well, development can't start the day someone gets the title. So the best organizations that we see are building these capabilities years in advance. They're giving future leaders time in front of the board, exposure to investors, real cross-functional decisions that they can make so that when they step up, they're not starting from scratch. They have a strong foundation already under their belt.
And can you talk a little bit about where CEOs are coming from today? Is it mainly internal, or are you seeing plenty of external candidates coming in?
Yeah, it actually harkens back to a conversation that we had last year, Sarah. Just looking at research across REIT CEO successions, we found that 7 in 10 are coming from internal over the last, call it 5 years. And that makes sense when you think about long cycle, the relationship intensive business like real estate. But what's striking is that this internal bias is happening as the succession pace accelerates. This is something that, again, I know we talked about last year was around CEO transitions generally rising and expected to continue to rise through most of the last decade and into this next decade, where we had 7 per year previously, and now we're at about 9 CEO transitions per year in 2023 and 2024. And with the average REIT CEO age ranging near closer to 60, with typical retirement around 64, we're seeing boards not thinking about this as one-off transitions anymore, but just in this active succession cycle, constantly thinking about not only CEO successions, but also how are we preparing that next level of leader and really making sure that we've got a strong bench to build from.
And can you elaborate about what you refer to in your article as an external leader? What does that mean and why does it matter?
You know, when we talk about external leadership in this context, we're not just meaning somebody who's hired from the outside. We're really thinking about CEOs whose field of vision extends beyond the organization itself. It matters more today because REIT leaders are no longer operating in purely traditional real estate lane. Investors are benchmarking REIT management teams against infrastructure platforms, private equity operators, and more capital markets fluent businesses. So the best CEOs today are reading capital flows. They're building these networks across public and private companies and translating those signals into operating decisions, including even items about whether to stay public, partner with private capital, consolidate, or reposition. Courtney was mentioning this earlier, but that's what we mean when we get into building networks and industry depth as it relates to leadership capabilities. The external leader is really now an enterprise translator, not just somebody who has pure capital markets exposure, but actually this enterprise translator who's connecting what's happening in those markets into what the organization should do across the enterprise.
Given that stat that you mentioned, 7 out of 10 candidates coming internally, would you say that REITs are doing enough to ensure that their bench is in place and ready to go when needed?
So the best REITs, they don't wait for succession to become urgent. What we observe is that they build their bench by distributing real leadership responsibilities early, not just through bigger titles, but actual leadership opportunity. So typically the best operators, best REITs out there are thinking about succession continuously. They're looking at least 3 to 5 years out for leadership needs they might have. And then they think about how can they expose rising leaders to the board, to investors, to cross-functional decisions where they actually can weigh in on operations, capital, talent, and strategy simultaneously. Succession failures are rarely failures of paperwork and process, but rather they're failures of how leadership was exercised over many years, culminating in a succession issue.
And I think it's fair to say that the operating environment today is extremely uncertain. Is there anything that REIT leaders can do to instill confidence within their teams?
Yes, this did come up several times. And one of the big answers we heard was steadiness. So several leaders actually told us that how you behave when things go wrong matters way more than how you behave when things go well. So in those tough moments, your team is watching, they're looking for cues. Is this manageable? Are we on the same page? Do we still know where we're headed? And the leaders who can be steady and instill confidence are not the ones who are projecting like a bravado or toughness of any kind. They're really the ones who are staying calm, staying visible, making decisions, even without perfect information. And one phrase I just wanted to highlight that stuck with me from the research was the idea of working through turbulence without losing the plot. So that's really what teams need, this consistency, being clear about where you're going, and as a leader, being able to say or willing to say that you don't know while still moving forward.
And what is your assessment of how the REIT industry is stepping up in terms of recognizing the nuances of successful leadership and its impact on their growth strategy?
I'd say, and this is coming from somebody who's done a lot of work outside of the real estate industry before partnering much closer with real estate platforms over the last couple of years, is that the industry does seem to be acknowledging that there's an opportunity here. In fact, we've heard folks talk about succession planning for what I understand to be multiple decades, but really it's starting to come to fruition based on all of the items we mentioned earlier. But there's a big difference between translating that acknowledgement of a challenge and actually putting in place a plan to act. We've seen stats, and not only in real estate, but across the board, that CEO turnover is going to continue to increase, and it hit an all-time high, or at least a significant high last year. But it's the REITs that are treating leadership capability the way that they treat portfolio construction, the same rigor, intentionality, looking at a long time horizon, that are going to differentiate. And so this is not something that can be only viewed as a soft lever, but rather a real differentiator, and something we're seeing the most strategic CEOs partner closely with their CHROs and their boards to start to address early on as they're thinking about. We've heard some REIT companies actually talk about an industry depth chart. So you're thinking about multiple levels of leadership and who might be able to step into those roles across the platform as they progress into potentially C-suite roles down the line. Those are the platforms that are going to continue to differentiate in terms of performance, as well as differentiate themselves in terms of the eyes of investors. And I would say that becomes even more important in a volatile environment or an uncertain environment in which we're currently operating.
So we've covered lots of interesting ground today, but any closing thoughts on what REIT leadership looks like today when it's an especially uncertain time?
I would say the next generation of REIT leaders is not likely going to inherit momentum. They're going to have to create it through judgment, through relationships, through the work of building organizations that are adaptable and can stay aligned even when things are uncertain. And the good news is the leaders we talk to already get this. They feel it. What's left is doing the work and developing the capabilities, as Mike said, on purpose, not by accident. And the organizations that do that and treat leadership as a real strategic asset and invest in it accordingly, those are the ones that we feel will come out ahead in the end.
Excellent. Thank you to you both, Mike, Courtney.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate the conversation. This was great.
And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.